Hello, lords and ladies of the internet. I'm the King of Candor, and today I'm going to be talking about the mystical elements behind your dice. These 5 dice, the D4, D6, D8, D12, and D20, are the 5 Platonic solids, and represent the different elemental states of the universe. Now, at first you might be thinking, I've lost my mind, and I'm going on some esoteric schizoid rant. My fellow hosts and podcast viewers did think that when I brought this up, but this is not my idea. This is actually an ancient idea. Let's first begin by covering each of the dice. The first shape we're going to cover is the D4, which is also called a tetrahedron. It is composed of 4 triangles of equal size. When rolling for it, the number is on top and it shows up on 3 sides of the dice where they meet. The next dice is the D6, otherwise known as a cube. This is your classic dice. It's made up of these 6 squares, which are all equal here. If you've ever seen any sort of gambling or game, you know what these guys are. Up next is the D8 or the octahedron. What's kind of cool about this one is it's 2 sets of 4 triangles put on top of each other. That gives it a total of 8 faces, hence its name. The next one is the D12, and it's my favorite one to say. It's also called a dodecahedron. This one's very unique because each side is a pentagon, meaning it has the honor of being the dice with the most sides on its face. Finally, we get to the traditional star of the show, the D20, otherwise known as the icosahedron, or icosahedron, depending on your pronunciation. I heard it both ways, which is 20 triangles carefully laid out to form a near-perfect circle. So why these shapes of dice? I think before I can answer this question, we need to cover other possible shapes of dice. Those of you familiar with gaming dice might notice the D10 is not covered in the list of Platonic solids. This is because it's an irregular polyhedron. All that means is it's not perfectly symmetrical, and it's shape that's 3-dimensional. If we use these shapes, we get a lot more funky types of dice. I've seen D3s, I've seen D5s, I've even seen D30s, and many more. In fact, on screen is now a mock-up of a bunch of differently shaped dice that could theoretically exist. Outside of prohibitively high costs to manufacture, a lot of these dice are just kind of ugly in my opinion. That's because they lack a lot of symmetry. You also rarely need dice like this except for specific calculations. So why haven't we seen any of these other dice become predominant? I would argue it's because gaming is an expensive hobby and people want to transfer their tools between systems. That's why games that use a D12 exist, even though it's one of the lesser used dice in D&D, which is the most popular game you probably have funky dice for. This is also why so many people get frustrated with things like the Fantasy Flight game series that have those special unique D6s. I have players who will never play their products on the grounds they refuse to support a company which requires you to buy dice specifically for their game, even if they do include enough in their game to play. It's a pride thing. Now, before we continue, if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. You can also join the Discord linked below. So, if modern games don't change dice because it was set in stone by the original D&D, why did Dungeons & Dragons pick these dice in the first place? Well, in reality, it was because of one man, David Wesley, and he was curious about ancient board games. According to David Wesley himself, he was looking into some historical board games that would help enhance the nightly wargaming experience. You see, back in the day, in 1965 specifically, David played with a group of wargamers. A war game is a military strategy game where you move miniatures around the battlefield. Think Warhammer 40k in the modern day. And these war games were always looking for new and exciting games to try out. For decades, you used the D6 dice to basically resolve all the mechanical rolling for these games, or you pulled a number out of a bag of chits. One day, David was reading about a game from 1880 that used something called a T-totem that would give you a number between 1 and 12. He had no idea what a T-totem is. It's one of these on screen. But he wanted to try the game. Since the results went up to 12, He figured it was a special name for a 12-sided dice. He then remembered some weirdly shaped dice he once used in high school trigonometry class. David called the school and got access to the supply book to see if these dice existed. They did, however, they were only sold in batches of 5, covering all the Platonic solids, and they were unlabeled. Determined to try this game, David bought the dice for $6, which is the equivalent to about $65 today. It ended up being that the game was kind of terrible. However, David had this cool set of Platonic polyhedral dice. He would show them to some of his other members of the group, and eventually he showed them to one Dave Arneson. Dave is one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons, and when he saw these dice, he fell in love with their strange nature. He was a budding game designer, and obviously will use D6s to resolve the conflicts. However, Dave immediately recognized these odd dice as having magical properties. Then, when him and Gary Gygax started working on their game, they immediately decided that the D20 was in the realm of the arcane, and thus they would start making magical rules that could use it. David Wesley, in his own words, would say, quote, "And they decided to use the cool polyhedral dice, even though I told them they should have just used regular dice, because no one's going to buy your game for $10. They'd have to spend another $6 to get the special dice before they can play it. But they ignored me, and of course, Dungeons & Dragons did not sell, and no one's ever heard of it. I'm glad he's a good sport about the whole thing." So, this is also why Dungeons & Dragons, although a little more expensive, came with its own dice. I'm pretty sure that was the deciding factor between people picking it up and other tabletop games, even if that's not talked about very often. In fact, dice are a key part of many early stories at TSR and D&D as a whole. James Ward, may he rest in peace, had a funny story about the dice that I cover in my video about him, linked here and below if you want to check out this video after this one. So why did this math book of all things have these weird dice to begin with? Well, you remember at the beginning when I was explaining the Platonic solids? That's why. These shapes are incredibly unique to the world of, well, shapes. All 5 of them are made up of regular polygons that intersect in a way to create a shape where these regular polygons all have the same number of shapes bordering them and are symmetrical. Due to this, many scholars have used these shapes to help prove mathematical formulas way more advanced than what I'm going to cover today on the channel. There are plenty of deep dives on YouTube, and I would probably require an engineer, not an author/game designer here, to really get into the nitty-gritty. I will cover, though, some of the historical and mystical uses of these shapes. So these dice were first discovered by either Pythagoras or Theaetetus, both ancient mathematicians. Yes, by the way, Pythagoras is the guy who discovered the Pythagorean theorem. Side note, he also founded a math-related cult that banned fafa beans to help achieve immortality. He was also allegedly such a badass that the most poisonous snake in the world bit him, and he bit it back, which returned the poison and killed the snake. I would love to do a deep dive on him, but since it's a little off the channel's brand, I'll only do it if this video gets like 200 likes and there's a lot of comments about it. That way I know it's actually wanted and worth the time. So back to dice. These shapes were identified, but it's not until Plato writes about them in Timaeus do we really gain their mystical properties. Here, Plato describes them as 3-dimensional polyhedrons. This basically means they are 3 shapes where all sides are regular polygons. That means that they have the same measurements for their angles and their sides. I'm going to put a couple examples here on the screen. At the point where the face meets is always the same number of faces, so if you look at the cube, and the corner of the cube always has 3 other squares coming off of it. When you take this concept and look at it 3-dimensionally, there's only 5 shapes in the world that qualify. There are technically more if you do concave versus convex, for those of you who are going to ask in the comments, but I'm only covering convex ones because the concave ones look like this, and they're really gross, and I hate them. Seeing these shapes, Plato realized they matched the Greek concept of the universe and the elements, so he mapped them onto the elements. I'm going to use this in the order he described them in Timaeus. Starting with the D6, or the cube, Plato uses this as his foundational piece. He says the cube is the most stable and immovable of all the bodies, as he calls them. This is the only solid form with squares, and what are squares but two triangles together, thus doubling their power. Plato also reasoned that there should be twice as much earth as there is any other element, which he says is true. Since this can be divided in half, it also makes sense that the other shapes would kind of be born from it to be triangles. Now to the D4. We find it is associated with fire. This is because it's the sharpest of the solids and fire hurts you. This may seem kind of silly at first, but he goes on to explain it symbologically as well. The way I found it is think of like a traditional campfire. It has a much wider base, and at the top the flame goes up to it, which kind of looks like billowing smoke. The D20, or the icosahedron, is used to represent water. This is because it's the roundest of all the shapes, and the easiest to flow. If you hold it in your hand, it will naturally want to roll off like water. It's still triangular, which means it has the same base powers, but is more fluid than its brother dice, the D4. There are also many uses for water, which is why it has so many different faces. One thing I find funny is he lists a couple things, such as blood, wine, and the ocean, as different examples of water. Now we get to the D8, the octahedron. This one is associated with air. This one Plato goes into the least detail on, and I kind of feel like he half-assed it. From what I could tell, it's because fire is the D4 and water is the D20. That leaves air, which is a mixture of fire and water, to be the one in between them. They also share that triangular element which links them. From my personal observations, I also think that if you think of the top of the D4 where the smoke builds up, the D8 has smoke billowing in each direction because it's just wind. Now for the most important one, the D12 or the dodecahedron. Strangely, this is considered the most powerful of all of them. It's not because you're measuring the amount of faces, it's because you're measuring the number of vertices and edges as well as the regular polygon that makes it up. That's why I covered it again at the intro here. Unlike all four previous ones, this one is not and cannot be cut into a triangle. Remember, a square is just two triangles. This is a pentagon. You cannot make a pentagon out of regular triangles. You need to bend them into unnatural shapes. This makes the D12 in the realm of the divine, or as Plato would call it, the aether. This is also related to the 12 constellations, and if you go into a lot of mysticism, the number 12 is very important. Jesus has 12 apostles, there are 12 hours of the day. There's lots of stuff here, and I'm not going to go into detail and cover it. You can easily Google the power of 12. However, after Plato, the Platonic solids became mostly used in mathematical equations as proofs for things. They always did stick around as quasi-mystical artifacts, and several cultures actually developed dice based on them, such as this Egyptian die here, which I think is the oldest dice we've ever found that's like a recognizable dice. Humans have always used dice-like things in mystical rituals, knuckle bones being a favored medium, but these solids are more precise, and because of that, more powerful divinations are possible using the Platonic solids. This is also why, by the way, when playing with dice, we often say, roll them bones. Mystical traditions that use them also taught the scientists and wise men, and they tried to bring those into other more physical fields. No one was really successful until we get to Johannes Kepler. Johannes Kepler uses these shapes when attempting to explain the 6 planets in his work, Mysterium Cosmographicum. Side note, that book title goes absolutely hard, and I wish that we had titles that good these days. You see, at the time, they only knew of 6 planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Johannes Kepler was attempting to prove Nicholas Copernicus' theory about the sun being the center of the universe, not the Earth. You see, at the time, Copernicus had assumed the orbits were perfectly circular, but that didn't quite line up with observed reality, and was one of the issues with proving his theory. The speed that some of the planets moved at caused them to appear and disappear at odd times. We now know that's because instead of a perfect circle, all the orbits are in ellipticals, which is more like an oval in shape. Kepler was lecturing at a university when one of his students asked him a question about the Platonic solids. That's when Kepler realized you could arrange the solids in a way that mirrors the orbits of the planets. Now, the way you do this is a little bit funky. The idea is you start with Mercury, which is a circle. Then you go to Venus, whose orbit is an octahedron or 8-sided dice. But you see, it's not really an 8-sided dice. You take an 8-sided die and then draw a line around all the points, and that line is the actual orbit. From there, you move to Earth, which is an icosahedron or 20-sided dice. Mars is a dodecahedron, which is the 12-sider. Jupiter is a tetrahedron, which is the 4-sided one. And finally, Saturn, the cube, which is a 6-sided dice. This was, like I mentioned earlier, disproven, and at the end of his life, even Kepler rejected the formula, but he kept getting around a 10% margin for error, which he was not happy with. What's pretty cool, though, is he asked for a whole bunch of astronomers who are now famous, such as Galileo Galilei, Tycho Brahe, Remius Ursus, George Laminius, and others to help verify his claims. Another side note, Tycho Brahe, who has an absolutely wild life and is definitely worth looking into if you had time, said he would provide 30 years of observational data to Kepler to help him identify it. Unfortunately, this data actually did disprove the Mysterium Cosmographicum. However, it did let them discover the elliptical orbits that I mentioned. It wasn't all in vain, because they also managed to discover 2 brand new shapes that are non-convex Platonic solids, which I'm going to put on the screen. I think these would make absolutely terrible dice, for the record. In the modern day, these Platonic solids and shapes are used for more than just Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop games. A lot of these neo-pagans and suburban witches use them as well. I've also seen crystal girls and astrologers trying to use them. Most of them are harkening back to Plato, and I'm going to be honest, it was very frustrating trying to understand what these groups thought about this. I've watched like 40 videos and read like 24 articles by different people with them just incorrectly citing Plato and not actually explaining the why behind these shapes. They just sort of assume that by telling you the triangle is fire, you'll be completely on board with it, and then they went off to do some wild stuff. Besides these local mystics, modern science actually still uses these shapes as well. These shapes are important when making space frames, which is the technical term for the metal used in space stations and spaceships. This is also used in meteorology and climatology, as making these shapes are better ways to get more accurate grids for predicting weather, since the way the Earth is shaped. There are also several crystalline structures that look like these shapes in the forms of minerals, as well as a lot of boron compounded things sort of look like them. There's a couple viruses, such as herpes, which kind of looks like a D20, and I find that really funny in the grand scheme. Something else I found really interesting at the end of my research is the original Dungeons & Dragons didn't actually come with D10s. That was announced at Gencon 8 in the year 1980. Beforehand, you used to use a D20, but it was not numbered 1 to 20. It was numbered 1 to 10 twice. This would allow you to have it both double as a 10-sided dice and a 20-sided dice. What I find really cool about this is it keeps the original dice as only the Platonic solids. It adds to the mysticism of the original product. I will also say, though, I think I'm glad the hobby no longer has that, because although it's a weird gangly cousin, I do like the D10 and the D100. In case you're wondering how they would adjudicate if you rolled a D20 that only had 10 twice, there were 2 ways of doing it. The first way, which the book recommends, is coloring one set of 1 through 10, which becomes your teens, and the second way is to roll 2 D20s and then add them up. What's funny about this is it means you technically cannot roll a natural 1. Original D&D, I guess, was brutal enough that I'm sure they didn't miss the instant failure. This is also why the dice came uncolored, like I mentioned at the beginning. I'm really glad I ended up doing this video. I think not a lot of people understand the history behind the dice and why they have been picked. Hopefully you future game designers can understand why, not only why these dice were originally picked, but probably why they stood around for so long. It's kind of hard to argue with a product that's been around for over 2,000 years. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this far. If you enjoyed the content, I'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed. I'm looking forward to your candor in the comments below, and have a great day.